And I would like to thank Helen and Pat and anyone else responsible for bringing me here. This is a wonderful place. I wish I spent more time here.
Thank you.
And Pat and I got to know each other fairly well several years ago. Sorry, when we showed us. Okay, thank you. When we taught a course together, he proposed we teach a course on Hume, Kant, and Rawls. And I said I would be delighted so long as he handled Kant. And he was willing probably to handle any named philosopher, but he did take the Kant task very seriously. And in fact, I think I learned more about Kant in that one afternoon seminar than in all the rest of the times I struggled to figure out what he was saying. So it was a really great occasion for me at that time. And what I'm going to talk about today partly grew out of that, grew out of Hume's way of trying to understand what's going on in lots of contexts. And he called it mirroring. I mirror what you do, and therefore get some understanding on my part of what it is you're doing, and begin to understand your motives, your intentions, and lots of other things. I'm going to give you two quotes from Hume. He says, "No quality of human nature is more remarkable, both in itself and in its consequences, than that propensity we have to sympathize with others," and here's the rich part, "and to receive by communication their inclinations and sentiments, however different from or even contrary to our own." So he thinks that we somehow, in being close together, during one of us having emotional responses to something, we share that emotional response, not by watching the response so much as literally by, in fact, living through it with the person who's having it. The other quotation is, "We may remark that the minds of men are mirrors to one another, not only because they reflect each other's emotions, but also because those rays of passion, sentiments, and opinions may be often reverberated and may decayed away by insensible degrees." One of those quotes is from Book 2 and one from Book 3 of Hume's treatise. So here he has an idea that he carries out at great length in two quite different contexts, and yet nevertheless we would like to know more about that. And he, in the later edition of the Inquiry on Morals, he leaves out the passage on this phenomenon, and one suspects it's because he got hammered for saying such a silly thing. And so he leaves it out in this later edition. It's too bad, because it would have been better had he in fact gone on to make more of it rather than to make less of it. So what mirroring does, many, many things, and I'm going to try to go through fairly quickly a list of maybe 7 or 8 things that it does for us. Either it does in our lives, or it does in our efforts to explain things. So those two roles that it has. Hume says, and he's not often given full credit for the claim because it sounds wrong to moral theorists, Hume says that he's giving us a science of morals. That's to say he's not giving us a correct view of what's right or wrong. That's not of his interest. But he is giving us a science, explaining why you and I think that X is right and Y is wrong. So that's a very important part of his contribution to us, and I think it helps explain many, many things that go on. And he also says, in a phrase that Rawls later borrows, Rawls says of some of the things that stand in the background that they are morality psychologized. And Hume is morality psychologized. So he gives us a moral theory, but it is based in the psychology of the people we are and the way in which we work. So that's a very important part of this whole enterprise, that bit of science. And it wouldn't make sense to call it a science of morality if in fact it were about telling us what's the right thing and the wrong thing to do. So that's a very important one of his contributions. Then it makes an evolutionary model of why we have this particular responsiveness to somebody else's emotions, why we sympathize, empathize with another, fairly clear. It's a fairly easy kind of evolutionary model, in fact probably easier than the much more common one we see that tries to explain how somehow people wind up being altruistic, even at cost to themselves. The idea that he has about mirroring gives us some entree to the black box of the mind, and he, in fact, makes that point, that that's an interesting part of what's going on. If I can somehow, just by being in your presence when you have some sensation, understand and grasp that, then I've actually entered your mind to some extent. He has a wonderful example that is used in many different ways, but it should be used here. It is that you or I, say, are standing on the beach and we see a boat going down out in the distance. We know that it's full of people. They're going to drown, most of them, as it goes down. And so we know intellectually that there's going to be huge loss, that there are going to be pain suffered and all sorts of things. That's not important in Hume's account. What's really important is if the boat were closer and we could actually see their faces in agony, then that would stimulate in us, unintentionally, it would stimulate in us the same kind of emotion that they're suffering. And so Hume's account of this boat going down out there is about what could be mirrored from the people if only if it were close enough and we could in fact be part of what's going on to some extent. Pat's work on various ways of understanding what somebody thinks a word means in the brain, or is where it is stored in the brain and so forth, might be one of the few cases in which we're approaching the kind of thing that Hume is talking about, and I would like to hear more of that. There was a huge debate in Scottish philosophy, and I'm not going to do the Scottish background of all of this. It only takes maybe 2/3 of the paper to do that, and maybe 1/3 of the paper to do the mirroring. And so I'm going to stick with the mirroring and not take up the Scottish stuff. But their literature is about sympathy in the time of Hume and a little before and a little after. Their work is on sympathy and sentiments. And sympathy, of course, is where I understand what's going on in your life and feel for it. Sentiments are perhaps not as clearly defined as essentially judgments, evaluations, and so forth. So I feel what your pain is, and now I judge it or somebody else or you, and that's the sentiment that I have from it. So when Bill Clinton was campaigning, he said, "I feel your pain." It is common to read what he said or to read other such things as saying somehow I literally perceive or feel what you're doing. So you stub your toe, I feel the pain in my toe. And Hume wants to say that that's the wrong way to read it. It is not the case that you or I suffer the literal same kind of pain that we can in fact mirror from somebody else. So I, on the campaign trail, say, I feel your pain. That doesn't mean that I somehow have a pain like the pain you have and not having enough money to pay your doctor's bills or whatever. It means that I understand that you're in pain over this issue, and that's a much more limited understanding, but also a more sensible one. So sympathy and sentiments get commonly run together. And in mirroring, that's correct. In other contexts, it would be wrong to run them together. They're separate categories. But if we do this mirroring, in fact, what happens is that I simultaneously get from you what you're feeling and react to it. I don't have to sit there and think through that. So there's no intervening action or thought or process. I just go directly from sympathy to sentiments, or from understanding what your pain is, and in fact judging whoever caused it, including plausibly you. So sympathy is a form, this is a strictly Scottish definition, is a form of non-verbal direct communication. That's a very important idea, that somehow you or I can communicate with each other about things without words, and the things that we can particularly communicate to each each other are these things like pains and benefits and happiness and so forth. So you and I, in one of Hume's things, he quotes Horace having said that the human countenance receives the joy and the pain of others. We shed tears on behalf of others, or we laugh or smile on behalf of others. And that's not because we are literally somehow taking their part. It's because they have such direct access to us that we feel those things. So I would like to somehow give a mirroring account of the wonderful time I had with Pat in our seminar, our joint seminar, and to say happy birthday, St. Pat.